Hello and welcome to today's webinar on an introduction to managing risk. My name is Holly and I'm part of the professional development team here at FIIRSM. Your speaker today is Steve Fowler. Steve provides consultancy services specialising in international business strategy, risk and resilience, occupational health and safety and change management, and Steve is also a fellow of the Institute as well. So before we get started, there are just a couple of things to run through first. So to begin with, you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you'll be able to ask any questions you have using the chat function on the bottom right of the screen. Type your questions as they come to mind and we will pick these up at the end. And secondly, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be available on the FIIRSM YouTube channel after the event. Right, that's enough from me. Over to you, Steve.
Well, welcome to this half-hour webinar on managing risk for OSH professionals. It's a taster of what's included in FIIRSM's full-day managing risk course. We're going to cover hazard, risk and uncertainty, why manage risk, the importance of context and environment, how to identify, analyse and treat risk, and a simple framework for integrated risk management. Now, we're going to start with uncertainty. We all live in a world that's fundamentally uncertain. Indeed, we live with those uncertainties every day, whether they be COVID-19, climate change, political change, terrorism, or cybercrime, or many others. Not all uncertainty, however, matters to every organisation. For instance, it might rain today, but would that affect your involvement in this webinar? Now, risk. Risk is what happens when uncertainty, which we've just talked about, and organisational objectives come together. In other words, it's uncertainty that matters. And you may have come across the term hazard as well. A hazard is a risk or a threat with a potential to cause injury and or ill health. So with so many terms in common usage, how do they all fit together? Well, maybe this diagram may help. What we can see here is that every risk is an uncertainty, but not every uncertainty is a risk. In other words, some uncertainties don't actually matter to organisations. They're just things that we live with. The other key point to take from the diagram is that risk, which is derived from the Italian word rischiare, meaning to dare, consists not just of threats and hazards, but also opportunities as well. Indeed, risk-taking can achieve positive as well as negative outcomes. So why manage risk? In the past, risk management was driven by regulation and by the need to protect life and limb. According to the International Labour Organization, 2.8 million people a year are killed by work-related accidents and disease. That's 1 every 17 seconds, or at least 2 since I started talking about this particular slide. This equates to about 4% of global GDP. Now, these days, there are other reasons for managing risk as well. And I'm just going to touch on some of the bullet points on the slide here. Now, many major projects fail in one way or another. I'm sure we can all think of examples, whether they be Crossrail, HS2, major construction projects or IT projects. Risk management can help achieve project success. Stakeholders too increasingly look for consistency in organisational performance, whether they be shareholders looking for a regular return on their investment, employees looking to their employer for a worthwhile or safe career, and customers deciding whether to buy from a particular brand. An organisation's reputation increasingly matters as well. And indeed, it's become one of the biggest factors in determining business value. In fact, up to 80% of the value of leading firms is derived from reputation, culture, and other so-called soft factors. This stuff really matters in hard business terms. So we've talked a bit about risk and why manage risk, but risk can be divided into many different classes. The key point to take from this particular slide is what's right for your organisation may not be right for another. So we've just given one example here, and it's a common method of dividing risks into strategic, financial, operational and hazard risk. As I just said, it's really important to keep in mind that this is a general way of dividing up risks. You may find that in your organisation you have another way of doing it. Now, we're probably all familiar with the last two categories, in other words, operational and hazard risks. These include areas such as workplace accidents, crime, IT failures, or failures of business processes. Increasingly, though, the first two categories, strategic and financial risks, are equally, if not more important. So let's just take the UK's decision to leave the EU. That's led to the pound dropping over 20% against the euro in 2 years. That's a fact. It's just the way it is. Now, that raises both opportunities, in other words, exports are cheaper, and threats, in other words, imports of raw materials are going to become more expensive. Therefore, the UK leaving the EU is a real financial risk for UK companies. But let's just bear in mind what we said earlier. A risk can be both a threat and opportunity, so it's worth keeping both sides of the coin in mind. But most of all, it's in the area of strategic risk where many organisations ultimately succeed or fail. In other words, the first strip on this slide. Technology change in particular, such as the advent of autonomous vehicles, raises both opportunities and threats for the motor industry, for instance. Now, so-called reputational risk isn't really a risk class on its own. It's the impact of other risks. Let's just think of one example here. Maybe you've had an accident at work. That can lead to an impact on the reputation of your organisation. Finally, a word on emerging risks. These are new risks that haven't been seen before, or existing ones that are evolving in unexpected ways. Now, whilst the world's always had the unexpected to deal with, in recent years, and particularly this year in 2020, they've become much more prominent. Indeed, the US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, talked about this way back in February 2002 in a talk to NATO in Brussels about the possibility of Iraq having so-called weapons of mass destruction. He said, there are known knowns, there are things that we know that we know. Well, I suppose that's obvious to all of us. There are known unknowns, that's to say there are things that we now know that we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we now know that we don't know. So what did he miss? Well, the one category he didn't cover were unknown knowns. And in 2020, we have a good example of that with us at the moment in COVID-19. COVID-19, or at least global pandemics, have been predicted to happen every year by the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And they've been considered to be a major threat to both the world, to countries, and to major businesses and populations around the world. However, it's probably fair to say that not many of us took that threat that seriously until this year. So what do we do about unknown knowns? One thing we can do about them is to network and read widely. If only we'd all read much more widely about the pandemic threat, maybe we would have seen it coming. The other thing is to know who as well as what to believe. Particularly in these days where so much is published on the web, it's really, really important to be able to differentiate between what's true and what's just opinion. Now, the good news is we have an international standard in ISO 31000-2018 that codifies good risk management practice. The standard is split into 3 parts: principles, process, and framework. And it's also a very good fit to ISO 45001, the health and safety standard, and ISO 9000, the quality management standard. Now, you'll see on this slide that there are a number of factors that make up the principles of managing risk. I'm not going to talk about all of them in this short webinar, but to just touch on a small number. Good risk management practice should always be proportionate. That's just down here on the left-hand side of the slide. What's right for a nuclear power plant isn't right for a small engineering firm. It should also be inclusive. It isn't a top-down or a bottom-up process, but should involve everyone throughout the organisation. And it should also use the best available information. Remember Donald Rumsfeld and the unknown knowns. Most of all, though, good risk management practice should be aligned to organisational objectives. Remember when defining risk earlier, we said that risk is what happens when uncertainty and organisational objectives comes together. Therefore, it's really important to align your approach to risk management to organisational objectives. It should be integrated throughout the organisation. Risk management should never be something done in a silo by one individual or small team of people. It should be everyone's business. And most of all, it should be focused around people. If you think about organisational successes or failures, quite often they're down to the people in that organisation. So that's a little bit about risk management principles. We're now going to move on to the second part of risk management, second part of ISO 31000, the risk management process, or what many people call doing risk management. Now you can see here that we've got two concentric circles. We've got an inner process supported by three other sets of processes. The important thing to take from the inner process is that it always starts with context and objectives. You always look at your context and objectives before moving on to risk assessment, or in other words, identification, analysis and evaluation. And only then do you then look at risk treatment, otherwise called risk response. Another key thing to gain from this particular diagram is that your approach to risk assessment and risk treatment should re-inform your organizational objectives and your context. So you may decide to change your business plan depending upon what you find when you go looking for risk and then dealing with it. Supporting this inner process, there are three other processes: recording and reporting risks, communicating and consulting on them, and monitoring and reviewing. Altogether, it makes up a continuous process linked to organizational strategy and values. Now, we said we start with context and objectives, and there are two parts to context: internal context and external context. Internal context includes areas such as the availability of capital and skills. It also includes, as I mentioned before, your business plan and objectives. Risk management should always start with these. Increasingly, though, it's a firm's culture that determines its future success. As the management guru Peter Drucker once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, external context includes those things which are changing in the outside world, whether they be political, economic, social, technological, legal, or environmental in nature. So that's a little bit on context and objectives. And we're now going to move on to the second part of the risk management process. In other words, risk assessment. This is what many people think of as the core of risk management. And it consists of two components. Firstly, risk identification, and then risk analysis and evaluation. Now, you will come across lots and lots of different ways of identifying, analysing and evaluating risk. In fact, there's a subsidiary standard to ISO 31000 called ISO 31010, and that sets out some 50 to 60 different techniques for risk identification, analysis and evaluation. Right here, right now, we're just going to touch on 4 of them. When it comes to risk identification, the simplest techniques are often the best, and therefore it's no surprise that I've listed interviews, surveys and workshops as the primary technique to use when looking for risk. It's also good, though, particularly at a time when so much is changing in so many unexpected ways, to look at scenario analysis, to look at alternative outcomes, depending upon what might happen in the outside world. Now, when we move on to analysis and evaluation, I'm just going to touch on two methods, but we will allude to the fact that there are lots of others, and you'll probably find many of the others in use in your own organization. The bow tie technique is a diagrammatic way of describing and analyzing the pathways of a risk from its various causes right through to an event happening, through to the various consequences that may arise from that event. In fact, it's a combination of two other techniques, fault tree, which looks at causes, and event tree, which looks at consequences. Now, those of you who work in financial services will probably have come across value at risk before. This is a financial technique widely used in banks that uses an assumed probability distribution of losses to calculate the value of an individual loss. The key thing about value at risk is that it assumes a specified probability during a defined time span. In other words, very steady state conditions. When you're looking at these techniques, always bear in mind that as well as the upside to each technique, there are downsides to every technique that you might use. And that in particular, valid and reliable data in sufficient quantity, form, and frequency is absolutely essential. You can't make conclusions from a very small quantity of data. And you should always consider the limitations of and the interpretation of data. So having identified and analysed your risks, it's important to keep a record. And the most normal way of doing this is through using what's called a risk register, listed first here on the list on this slide. The information contained in a risk register can be communicated in many ways. And we're just going to touch on one in this short webinar, heat maps, otherwise called risk matrices, but bear in mind that other methods are available. And most of all, don't underestimate the importance of informal or face-to-face risk reporting. These are often the best way to get over true information about risk to hard-pressed business executives. So we've got an example here. It's quite a busy slide, an example of a risk register. And you'll see in the first column, and apologies if you can't actually read the words, the actual words don't matter. It's just an example of a risk here. So it's being described here. And in the second column, we've given an indication of its potential impact and its potential likelihood on the business. So for this particular risk, we've said the impact is medium and the likelihood is medium. We've then listed a risk owner. My own personal view is that the risk owner should always be an individual, for instance, Steve Fowler, rather than personnel committee. We all know what happens when something's allocated to a committee. It might not get done. In the fourth column, we're listing here the controls that the organisation's decided to put in place to deal with the risk here. And then the second half of the risk register, you see the first half is headed gross risk. Second half, which is headed net risk, looks again at the impact and likelihood of the risk after the application of these controls. So we can see that the impact has stayed medium there, and then after the controls it's medium, but the likelihood is reduced from medium down to low. So this shows that the controls are having some impact on that risk. The rest of the risk register deals with further actions that might be taken to deal with the risk. Now, keep in mind that last risk. Remember that we said initially it was medium impact and medium likelihood. A heat map shows what a risk looks like in terms of its potential impact on the organization compared with other risks. So remember we said the impact of the last risk was medium, in other words, on a 1 to 5 scale, 3, and the likelihood was medium, in other words, 3. So that places it round about here in the orange zone on this heat map. So you might find that other risks listed on your risk register, one might be down here in the green area here, a low impact, low likelihood risk, and another one which is potentially high impact, high likelihood risk might be up here. So in other words, you've got a visual indication as to which risks are most likely to happen and most likely to impact your organization. It's just a much easier way of looking at risks in comparison with each other than ploughing through a risk register. So we've looked at context and environment. We've also looked at risk assessment. What more is there to do? Well, unless we actually take some action, there's no point in doing anything before that. Now, let me introduce you to the 4 T's: tolerate, treat, terminate, and transfer. And this is just shorthand for different ways that we might deal with a risk. For a minor risk, we might tolerate the risk, we might accept it, we might take no action but continue to monitor it. I guess we can all think of examples of things that are potentially risks in our lives, our personal lives or our working lives, where we've decided we'll just take the risk. There's no point in doing anything about it. We'll live with the consequences. For anything more substantial, we might decide to actually treat the risk. In other words, we'll put in place a physical process or human or cultural change. So a physical change could be something like installing a sprinkler system or putting a guard on a machine. A process change might involve changing a process completely to eliminate a risky part of that process. Or a human change might involve retraining someone to carry out a process in a different way. Terminating. For very major risks where no significant risk treatment is available, we might just decide to stop doing the thing that might lead to the risk. For instance, you're a company exporting to a country where war has just broken out. There's not much you can do to reduce the risk. So what you decide to do is to stop exporting to that country. You terminate the risk. And finally, risk transference. I always think that this is a bit of a misnomer and personally prefer to call it risk sharing. So people talk about risk transfer, insurance as a form of risk transfer, or outsourcing or using contract terms. But if you just think about those for a few moments, they can all go wrong. Insurance companies can go out of business, leaving you with a risk. And equally, what you thought was a valid insurance claim, the insurer might feel isn't a valid insurance claim. Equally, the world's full of outsourcing arrangements that didn't quite work out, or contract terms that are interpreted by the other side's lawyer in a different way to the way your lawyer interpreted it. Always remember that you remain accountable for the risk, even if you transfer it. And this brings us back to reputation. You know, you could do anything you like to try and transfer risk to someone else, but if it's your name on the product or the service, your customers will feel you're responsible for what happened. And you might put any of these in place, but don't forget there might still be residual risk. That's one reason why the risk management process is a circular process, why you should always go round the loop again. So having eliminated some risk, you might then decide to put further treatments in place to deal with it. Now, remember earlier I said that there were 3 parts to ISO 31000. We talked quickly about principles. We've now spent a fair bit of time talking about process, and I'm now going to move on to risk management frameworks. In other words, the organization for managing risk within your own organization. Leadership for this must come from the top of the organization. And a typical framework follows the plan, do, check, act cycle, familiar to those who've used the quality, environmental, health and safety management system standards. But in this case, they're known as design, implement, evaluate, and improve. But I hope, like me, you feel that design is really plan, implement is really do, evaluate is really check, and improve is really act. So it's the same thing as you might do in a quality management cycle or a safety management cycle. Where does all this lead? Well, putting in place a framework usually leads to production of a hard physical risk management policy. What this does is it sets out the rationale for managing risk in your organization, usually in plain language, and linked to organizational vision and values. Documents like this are only of any value if they can be understood by everyone who reads them. It should set out legal and regulatory requirements for your organization when it comes to managing risk, who's accountable for risk, and who's got responsibility for which parts of the risk management process, and what resources are available to support them. This should cover the terminology that you use in your organization. Remember, I said earlier that when we were talking about risk treatment, some people call that risk response. What do you call it in your organization? It should set out the process that you're using, the tools that you're using, and the timetable. A word on risk appetite. This is the board's view of what level of risk the organization's willing to take. And it's really important that no matter who puts the risk appetite statement together, it should be agreed at board level, and it should fit with your business plan. And then finally, it should set out the usual areas that are covered in policies. In other words, conflicts of interest, measurement and reporting, ownership of the policy, and the review process. Now we're coming to the end now. I said at the beginning that we would look at hazard, risk, and uncertainty and how they fit together. We then said we'd look at why we manage risk, what's the rationale behind it. We then spent a bit of time looking at the importance of context and environment, both internal and external. And then I took you through a simple risk management process cycle. In other words, how we identify, analyze, and then treat risk. And finally, we've just looked at a simple framework for integrated business risk. Now, that's almost the half hour up. I think we've got a bit of time for some questions. So if you want to start thinking about your questions and using the chat facility, which should appear on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, we'll try and deal with those questions now.
Right, thank you, Steve. So yes, as a reminder, you can use the chat function on the bottom right-hand side of the screen to ask any questions that you have. Whilst we're waiting for some questions to come through, I've got a couple of questions for you, Steve. So first of all, how do you think the coronavirus pandemic will impact the way organisations approach risk management in the future?
How long have we got? That's the answer to that question. We could spend all day talking about this. I'll try and keep it brief. I suppose, if we're honest, pandemics weren't unexpected. If you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, which is published every day, every year, free to air, available on the web, every year, apart from actually last year, pandemics were listed as one of the top 5 risks to the world. And that's to every country in the world. So we can't pretend that we weren't expecting this. I suppose all that we can say is that we chose not to protect against this particular risk. In terms of what we might do about this particular risk, well, 2 things. Right here, right now, the obvious focus is on operational management, helping our organizations survive. So as risk managers, risk and safety managers, we should be doing everything we possibly can do to keep our organizations running. One thing we can do in that respect is, some of the side risks are quite obvious. Things like impact on supply chains, impact on fraud, cybersecurity, and so on. But who foresaw that people were going to start attacking mobile phone masts and the impact that that might have on communication? So, our role as risk manager at a time like this is to help our businesses think about the unexpected, things like attacks on mobile phone masts. At the same time, we can help senior management and boards by planning for the long term. And there's really 3 parts to that. First part is survival. How do we survive long term? Everyone says the world's going to look very different. I'm sure it will. We can ask the question, what are the most important changes that we face as an organization? There are going to be major changes. It's difficult to predict what they will be at this point, but by asking that question, we can start to think about them. And finally, what are our options as regards those changes? So if you like, providing some structure to the sort of questions that senior management and boards should be asking at the moment anyway. It's quite a long answer, but I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Okay, we've had a few questions come through from the participants now. So the first one is, how can we get people other than the board to be aware of business risk and get on board with it?
That's a really good question, Melissa. My own approach to this is that things like risk registers and heat maps and risk management information systems are all well and good, but we're all human beings. And the best way to communicate risk is to go and talk to people about risk face to face, if possible. In the current world, that might mean face to face across the internet using something like Microsoft Teams or Zoom or GoToMeeting. But talking to people in the language that they use themselves. Don't become a risk geek. It won't be appreciated.
Okay, and then another is it possible that ISO 31000 will be integrated into ISO 45001 as part of the recertification process?
Well, Gary, if ever I could have given someone a question to ask today, this is the question to ask today of all days. So this morning, I got through email, an advanced copy of the International Standards Organization new standard, IWA 31. Now, this has been published this morning, and it is a set of guidelines on using ISO 31000 in what are called management system standards. So obviously, for those of us who work in health and safety, ISO 45001 is a management system standard, as is the quality management standard, as are business continuity, environmental, and many other standards. So I haven't been through the whole of IWA 31 this morning. It is quite a short document. It is only 10 pages plus some appendices. But what it tries to do is to explain in practical terms how you use 31,000 in conjunction with standards like 45,001. So I'm going to be going through this in a lot more detail over the next few days to distill out what there is in the standard that's of practical use. And then perhaps we might look at publishing something on that through the Institute, either through the Sentinel or through the website or something.
Okay, and then the next question is, thanks for the webinar, Steve, much appreciated. How do we go about consolidating risk within an organisation, or is it simply to do with the level of risk maturity in an organisation?
I could ask you, John, the same question, actually. If there was a simple answer to this, then I suppose every organisation would have done it. To my mind, it's down to getting the people at the top of the organisation on side with the value that risk management adds. If ever there were a time for risk management to stand up and be counted, it's now. Now's the time to show your value. If we can show our value to our CEOs, to our chairmen, to our council leaders at the current time, it will go a long way towards getting them on side to understanding what value we add. And that in turn will lead to a better understanding of the value of risk within the organization. I always think if you get the boss on side, then it's much easier to get the rest of the organization on side because he or she will do it for you.
Okay, and we've got one other question. So do you see a place for technology, and for example, artificial intelligence, showing up in risk management to detect future threats or risk events?
Obviously, Chris, the answer has got to be yes. I think the the different ways of doing that, there are going to be a lot of different systems that one can use to actually help with that process of risk identification. I've seen some people automate their the data that they're being given by their organization that potentially might imply there could be a potential future threat. Automation is a great way of seeing the wood for the trees, trying to sort through data to identify what is going to be most relevant. And by most relevant, I mean most likely to happen, and also most likely to happen in a sort of high impact way. So yes, but I think it's probably the subject of not just another webinar, but probably a whole week's course.
Okay, and a final question from me. We held a webinar last week with one of our partners, Avetta, on business continuity management. Can you tell us a little more about the link between risk management and business continuity management?
My first answer to that question, Holly, is a question to you. What did they say? No, but it'd be interesting to see whether my answer is the same answer as their answer. Because, being something of an old wizened cynic, I would say that if you ask risk people how risk and business continuity fit together, they'll always say business continuity is part of risk management. And if you ask business continuity people how they fit together, they'll always say that risk management's a key part of business continuity. For the average person in the street, the average person who isn't a risk or business continuity geek, they are both part of the same set of disciplines. So if you want to draw a line between them, risk deals with what might happen and what might happen that matters most to our organization. In other words, think back to the beginning of the webinar. Risk is uncertainty that matters. It's where uncertainty hits our organizational objectives. And therefore, risk management looks at how do we detect those risks? How do we analyze them, work out how important they are in terms of impact and likelihood? And then what specifically do we do to protect ourselves? Now, one of the things we can do to protect ourselves is to put in place business continuity planning, which I always think of as a means of risk treatment. In other words, it's a way of preparing against any sort of event to create stronger organizational resilience. The thing about good business continuity planning is that it shouldn't necessarily take into account your own view as to what might happen to your organization, because you can bet, as with this year, 2020, that what's going to happen isn't what you planned for. Okay, some organizations thought, there's a risk of a pandemic. Let's plan for an influenza pandemic, because that's what most people thought was going to happen. Very few organizations or individuals thought to plan for a coronavirus pandemic, and they are subtly different. Now, a good business continuity plan would be agnostic in terms of the type of pandemic. It would look instead at what the impact might be rather than what the cause might be. So, they are related. In the eyes of the average person in the street, they are the same thing. We shouldn't get too hung up about the differences between them. Instead, we should look at how the two disciplines work more closely together.
Thanks, Steve. And we've got one last question from the participants before we close today. So this is from Melissa. So what do you see in the future around the role of risk managers and HSE professionals coming out as a result of COVID? Are more resources needed, levels in the organisations changing, etc., or will it be the same as before?
Thanks, Melissa. That's a great question to end on. Now is the time to prove your value to your organisation. If you can prove your value to your organisation, whether you're a safety manager, a health and safety manager, an environmental manager, a risk manager, then you're more likely to be invited back to get involved in the next crisis that hits your organisation. In fact, what you should be doing is getting involved before the crisis hits the organisation. I spoke to a lady once who is the chief risk officer for US naval ship repair yards in San Diego in America. Now, She's not an American, she's British. In fact, US naval ship repair yards are owned by British Aerospace, a British company, which was something I didn't know until then. Americans give the Brits responsibility for mending their naval vessels. Anyway, she said the way she gets involved in her business is through doing a number of things. One is speaking the language of business, because she's in quite a financially orientated business where everyone talks about revenue and profit and margins and so on and so forth. It's important to use that language in the way that she talks to people. The second thing was to invite herself to meetings. If you're in a large company, it doesn't work so well in a small company. If you're in a large organization, if you turn up to the meeting, usually nobody knows who's supposed to be at the meeting anyway. The good thing about going to the first meeting is your name then appears on the minutes, so you get invited back to subsequent meetings. It's a great way of infiltrating the organization. The third way is just to make sure that you're out there and being heard. And again, data, risk registers, heat maps, they're all great things. But talking to people about risk, understanding what they're trying to achieve in their own job, in terms of their key objectives, their key projects, and then finding a way to help them is also a great way to improve your own profile within the organization. So becoming a go-to yes person rather than someone who's seen to turn up at the last minute and then explain, actually you did it the wrong way. You don't want to be negative.
Right, thanks, Steve. So that's all the time we have for questions today. Before we go, you may be familiar with the one-day managing risk training course that we usually run 4 to 5 times a year and on a face-to-face basis. We're currently developing an online version of this course so that we're still able to deliver this learning because it's really highly rated and well received at this time. If you're interested in finding out more about this online version, please register your interest at training@iirsm.org and I can provide you with more details as soon as they become available. And then secondly, we're also in the process of developing our certificate in managing risk qualification in conjunction with NEBOSH. And this is due to pilot in the autumn, and there are plans for the pilot to be available both online and face-to-face. Again, if you're interested in finding out more about this or joining the pilot, please register your interest by emailing training@iirsm.org. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you once again to Steve for delivering this presentation for us and to all of you for joining. Enjoy the rest of your days and goodbye.